Greetings, church. Welcome to another live stream devotional. I hope you've been enjoying the studies in the book of Esther. I hope that you've been able to see in our studies the presence of God. We've mentioned that God is not mentioned in the book of Esther, but his presence is so very prevalent. As we read through each chapter, you can see the presence of God is very, very strong. And we'll see that even more as we continue our studies in the middle chapters of the book of Esther. I just want to read the first 4 verses of Esther chapter 5. Now it came to pass on the 3rd day that Esther put on her royal apparel and stood in the inner court of the king's house, over against the king's house, and the king sat upon his royal throne in the royal house, over against the gate of the house. And it was so, when the king saw Esther the queen standing in the court, that she obtained favor in his sight. And the king held out to Esther the golden scepter that was in his hand. So Esther drew near and touched the top of the scepter. Then said the king unto her, What wilt thou, Queen Esther? What is thy request? It shall be given, even the half of the kingdom. And Esther answered, If it seem good unto the king, let the king and Haman come this day unto the banquet that I have prepared for him. I would just like to stop there and just kind of recap what we've learned up to this point. I'd like to go back to chapter 3. In chapter 3, we see that Haman was promoted to a very high position. He was second in command to the king, which is kind of surprising because if you remember at the end of chapter 2, Mordecai saved the king's life. He heard of an assassination plot to kill the king, and he informed Esther of that and virtually saved the king's life. So if you'd think if anyone was due for a promotion, it would be Mordecai. But no, Haman gets the promotion. And then Haman comes up with a plan to destroy Mordecai and the Jewish people. Haman's plan is approved by the king and set into motion. And there were letters sent out to 127 provinces. That brings us up to Esther chapter 4. In Esther chapter 4, Mordecai fully informs Esther of Haman's plan. And Esther sets up a 3-day fast. That's a good response to trials. It's a good response to tribulations, to go to God in prayer. And that's exactly what we find Esther doing. She sets up a 3-day fast. She gets her maids, she gets Mordecai and the Jewish people to join her in this fast. And this is where Esther really shines in this chapter. If you look at verse 16 in chapter 4, this is where Esther said her famous words, "If I perish, I perish." Here in chapter 4, she shows great courage, great character as she stands before the king. This brings us up to chapter 5. This is where Esther takes initiative, and she invites the king and Haman to a banquet. And the king asks Esther, "What is your request?" And Esther doesn't answer the question. She responds by inviting them to another banquet. I think she might have heard that old saying, "The way to a man's heart is through his stomach." I think there's some truth in that. But we find Esther has prepared and prayed for this moment, and she's now waiting on God. What's the life lesson here in chapter 5? Now, we're going to go into this in a lot more detail this Sunday. I hope you can join us. But there's 5 life lessons that we can learn from Esther in chapter 5. When facing trials, wait on the Lord before taking action. All too often when we face trials, we take action and regret it later. So I would encourage you to wait on the Lord. When dealing with a difficult person, trust in God to open doors. We can't change that person's heart, but many times God will. When working through unpleasant situation, trust God for patience. We have a tendency not to be very patient, but God can grant us patience in times of troubling situations. When standing against an enemy, ask God for courage. And that will happen. Sometimes we get in situations dealing with people where we need God's courage. And I'm sure Esther prayed for that. Number 5, when making decisions, seek God's wisdom in prayer. I think of James 1:5, if a man lack wisdom, let him ask of God. So here are 5 practical things that I think we can learn from the life of Esther and apply to our own lives. Come and join us this Sunday as we learn from Esther's life some practical lessons on the Christian life. God bless you and have a blessed day.